Today we see spectacular examples of text analysis. Things like Word2Vec can complete analogies. That's a pretty phenomenal feat when you think about it. Or we look at topic models or text networks and their capacity to reduce the vast complexity of text databases into chunks that we can categorize and understand. But it's pretty amazing when you go back and try to study the history of this field, and you see how far people were as far back as 1930. So this is Harold Laswell. He was a political scientist. He was one of the pioneers in text analysis. And way back in 1938, he had this kind of simple and yet pivotal realization, which is that we can classify references into categories according to the understanding which prevails among those who are accustomed to the symbols. References used in interviews may be quantified by counting the number of references which fall into each category during a selected period of time or per 1,000 words uttered. So this is the first attempt to think about, that I could find, to think about words as a unit of analysis for a social science analysis. And if you've read a little bit in this field, you'll know about kind of keyword-based approaches. So some of the first things that Laswell did, which were kind of low-hanging fruit, was simply count the prevalence of certain types of words. He was particularly interested, like many social scientists at this time, in understanding mass persuasion and in understanding propaganda in between the world wars. There was quite a lot of federal funding in the US and elsewhere that, as we'll see in the next section of these slides, powered a lot of the innovation in text analysis through the post-war period as well. So we know keywords. Keywords means counting the prevalence of a word. But as far back as 1938, and at the tender age of 21, Laswell was developing methods that track the association between word utterances and physiological reactions, including pulse rate, electrical conductivity of the skin, and blood pressure. Some of the same things we're doing today. So it's pretty startling to see that as far back, now 80 years ago, more than that, folks were already doing some fairly sophisticated things with text analysis. So if Laswell was kind of one of the founding figures in social science, of course, if we wanted to include the humanities in this endeavor, we could go back much, much further. But if we're looking at, and if we're defining our field in terms of quantitative text analysis with relevance to social science, I think it's fair to credit either Laswell or his contemporary, whose name I won't attempt to produce because my Russian is not very good. But this is a Russian literary scholar who introduces the first quantitative analysis of narratives in Russian fiction. Fast forward about 15 years, the psychologist Peter Gottschalk uses content analysis to track Freudian themes. You can see an early theme here is the kind of space between psychology and politics and text. And then in the 1950s, which was really in many ways a golden era for artificial intelligence, insofar as many of the most popular tools today, like neural networks, were actually being created. What changed and why has it taken us so long to start using neural networks? Primarily, it's been a delay in the potential or capacity of computers to process neural nets. But many of the core ideas and themes were created in the 1950s. Again, out of the powered in large part by attempts to use text-based data for intelligence purposes, for military purposes. So one of the key tasks that many people wanted text analysis to perform in this post-war period was to do text translation, to take, for example, a German text and turn it into English, or to break codes, because codes were used in military operations. And so a lot of the early attempts were designed precisely to translate text. And the first automatic translation of text, which was part of something called the Georgetown experiment, occurred in 1954. And around this time, we see some early political scientists, Berelson, Steller, and Wallace, analyzing the Federalist Papers. And again, we see digital humanities, what we now know as digital humanities, coming online as well, again, mostly in Russia. Fast forward to the 1960s, the psychological analysis of text, kind of psychometric properties of text, remain a focus of interest. And today we're seeing a resurgence of that interest. Of course, things have changed a lot since then. There's more text data. It's more readily available. It's easier to parse and analyze. But many of the same questions that folks like James Pennebaker, the social psychologist today, are asking about psychometric properties of text have their origins way back in the 1960s. But a real kind of watershed moment for the field was the birth of natural language processing and computational linguistics. So without going too deep into the history of the field of linguistics, up to the 1980s, there was a kind of formalism around language. It was assumed that there could be universal laws of language from which we could derive insights about how to measure meaning in a text. We could reliably predict one word given other words, or one meaning given a set of meanings. And in the 1980s, this formal approach to linguistics experienced many challenges, and an emerging consensus was that natural language was never going to be predictable, both because of the enormous complexity of human language, but also because it's constantly evolving and changing. And so the field made kind of a shift towards looking at language usage in natural contexts. The 1980s also witnessed an increase in some of the earliest developments of machine learning in the modern era. Natural language processing was an obvious candidate because there was large data. We needed large data sets to begin to train models. In the 1980s, we also witnessed automated techniques for counting parts of speech. In political science, there's a movement to begin automated event coding, so detecting, for example, violent conflicts using only newspaper data, things like that. The aforementioned James Pennebaker, the social psychologist, develops linguistic inquiry word count, which remains one of the foremost dictionary-based methods for analyzing text. In the 1980s and 90s, network theorists began to get involved in text as well, including Roberto Franzosi, who wrote a wonderful book called From Words to Numbers. And in 1998, or thereabout, folks began to develop tools like latent Dirichlet allocation. Pioneers like David Blay would later publish kind of seminal papers that formed kind of the basis for the modern version of topic models, which, if you're uninitiated, these are essentially ways of deriving latent structures from unstructured text-based data, not unlike a cluster analysis in some ways. So around 2001, the Blay paper comes out. Peter Bierman, John Moore, sociologists, are doing parallel analysis of text using networks. And 2003, we see Mallet created. That's one of the back ends for topic modeling. That was one of the kind of early and important ones. And then we really start to see the mainstreaming of automated text analysis into social science via kind of leading figures who have spoken here at the Institute before, like Gary King and Dan Hopkins, Kevin Quinn, and many others who formed an interesting workshop at the University of Washington called Tools for Text, which created the basis for a lot of particularly the R language that is around today. So hopefully by now you've seen that this is a highly interdisciplinary field. It would not exist without the common effort or the collaborative effort of political scientists, psychologists, sociologists, linguists, computer scientists. It's really one of the most interdisciplinary fields and exciting fields, and as I mentioned at the outset, I suspect we will continue to see that going forward as we watch text-based data just explode everywhere. No matter where your disciplinary background is, you can probably find someone from your field involved in this early story.